It's April 4th, 2022, 39 days of war in Ukraine. And this is Poking the Bear, Part 2. And to recap the previous show, Twitter hot takes on the war in Ukraine are garbage. They assert that Volodymyr Zelensky is a war criminal, that Russia isn't doing bad things, and in general, they just push pro-Russian propaganda. And while we haven't been doing our regular reporting on Ukraine so that we could take time to write this two-part episode, we feel it's important to bring up the issue of Bucha, but briefly. After leaving the Ukrainian city of Bucha a few days ago, Russian soldiers left behind a gruesome trail of dead Ukrainian citizens. Internet sleuths have called this a false flag. So have Russian media.
Now, Russia has called for a UN Security Council meeting on Monday following what the Kremlin dismissed as a blatant provocation by Ukrainian radicals in the town of Bucha in the Kiev region. Ukraine's defense ministry, as well as several media outlets, released videos and images showing bodies of civilians lying in the streets and others piled in mass graves. Kiev insists this is proof of Russian war crimes. The Russian Ministry of Defense claims the evidence appeared only some time after Ukrainian troops moved into the town.
That was Sean Thomas, anchor for Russian state television RT International. In other words, the claim from the Kremlin is that Ukraine itself committed mass murder to make Russia look bad. Aerial footage taken March 31st, the day after Russian troops left the area, shows bodies in the streets of Bucha and a mass grave near a church, refuting Russia's claim. And I refer you again to the 4 Ds of propaganda. This one is dismiss. If someone claims you've committed mass murder, accuse them of the same. It helps if you control state media. We left off the last episode with a series of questions. From the Budapest Memorandum in 1994 to the regular expansion of NATO over the past 30 years to the Orange Revolution and Maidan Revolution, at what point did Russia, and more specifically Putin, feel that Russia faced an existential threat? What exactly drove the all-out invasion of Ukraine? Was it convenience or fear that drove Putin? Was it national security or pride? Was any of Ukraine's inner struggle Putin's business? We speak of Ukraine as if it must somehow answer to Russia, as if the two are connected by some contractual bond. They share history, they share blood, they share a border. But the sovereignty of Ukraine was the unifying factor that bore the patchwork coalition against a common enemy, a president and government working more in the interest of Russia than Ukraine. If Putin saw the rejection of Russian influence as provocation, perhaps the trajectory now becomes clear. Without a government favorable to Russian interests, Ukraine indeed becomes a security liability once it favors the European Union. A security liability that is only to Putin, mind you. Not to the people of Russia, not to its sovereignty, and certainly not to its existence. Solely in the mind of Putin does the removal of Yanukovych during the Maidan Revolution spell danger for the Russian Federation. The result of Maidan was the release of Yulia Tymoshenko from prison, charges against her dropped, the dissolution of the Berkut riot police who had cracked down on dissent, and Ukraine reverted to parliamentary presidential elections. There's another issue at play here. Russia's paranoia is at least granted legitimacy through the released phone call between Assistant Secretary of State Victoria Nuland and the U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine, Jeffrey Pyatt.
What do you think?
I think we're in play. The Klitschko piece is obviously the complicated electron here, especially the announcement of him as Deputy Prime Minister. And you've seen some of my notes on the troubles in the marriage right now, so we're trying to get a read really fast on where he is on this stuff. But I think your argument to him, which you'll need to make, I think that's the next phone call we want to set up, is exactly the one you made to Yachts. And I'm glad you sort of put him on the spot on where he fits in this scenario. And I'm very glad he said what he said in response.
Good. So I don't think Klitsch should go into the government. I don't think it's necessary. I don't think it's a good idea.
Yeah, I mean, I guess you think, what, in terms of him not going into the government, just let him sort of stay out and do his political
homework. He's now gotten both Seri and Ban Ki-moon to agree that Seri could come in Monday or Tuesday.
Okay.
So that would be great, I think, to help glue this thing and have the UN help glue it. And, fuck the EU.
No, exactly. And I think we've got to do something to make it stick together because you can be pretty sure that if it does start to gain altitude, the Russians will be working behind the scenes to try to torpedo it.
You know, while at first glance this sounds like a behind-the-curtain look at international puppetry, with Vitaly Klitschko, current mayor of Kiev and former professional boxer, being shut down as potential deputy prime minister following the Maidan Revolution and a disparaging dismissal of the role of the European Union in assisting and pulling the strings, we don't really get a full picture of the U.S. power behind this diplomatic phone call. It is true that Klitschko did not become deputy prime minister, but it's not clear that Nuland really knows what the fuck she's talking about as far as Klitschko's political experience. Not at all. The recording of Nuland and Pyatt was published February 7th, 2014, but it's not clear when the call took place. It doesn't really matter. Klitschko was President Viktor Yushchenko's full-time advisor by October 2006, and he ran for mayor of Kiev in 2006, and he got 26% of the vote, but lost overall. In 2012, Klitschko was elected to the Ukrainian parliament and chosen as the leader of his party, the Ukrainian Democratic Alliance for Reform, or UDAR. And on February 28, 2014, Klitschko announced he would run for president. He changed course a month later and ran for mayor of Kiev again, and won with 57% of the vote. Remember, Nuland told the EU it could fuck off and that Klitschko shouldn't, quote, go into the government, in that recording published February 7th. He later announced a presidential run on February 28th and was elected mayor of Kiev in May. So, if you want to say that this series of events follows Nuland's puppet mastering, then perhaps you and I have a different association with reality. That isn't to say that the phone call isn't damning in its own right. It's just basic evidence that the U.S. meddles in foreign governments. That's fucked up. But it's not the pearl-clutching moment I think some would like to make it out to be. Just remember that Russia had been doing this very same exact thing with Yanukovych. Add to that the fact that Russia bugged and released a U.S. Department of State phone call, and I think it's safe to call this whole episode a wash. Both global powers are doing fucked up shit. However, the U.S. does not come across as being particularly adept at foreign meddling. Klitschko winds up elected to a position of power, not outside the government and learning his politics at all, but instead mayor of the capital city. That the U.S. could be this arrogant and ineffective, well, that appears to be a feature, not a bug. And if the name Victoria Nuland sounds familiar, it's because we've had to deal with her bullshit all over again 8 years later, this time as Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs. I'm so sorry.
Well, I only have a minute left. Let me ask you, does Ukraine have chemical or biological weapons?
Ukraine has biological research facilities, which, in fact, we are now quite concerned Russian forces may be seeking to gain control of. So we are working with the Ukrainians on how they can prevent any of those research materials from falling into the hands of Russian forces should they approach.
I'm sure you're aware that the Russian propaganda groups are already putting out there all kinds of information about how they've uncovered a plot by the Ukrainians to release biological weapons in the country and with NATO's coordination. If there's a biological or chemical weapon incident or attack inside of Ukraine, is there any doubt in your mind that 100% it would be the Russians that would be behind it?
There is no doubt in my mind, Senator, and it is classic Russian technique to blame on the other guy what they're planning to do themselves.
And again, Nuland fumbles. While deliberate in her language, this is the kind of soundbite that can't really be taken out of context because there is no context. It helps to feed into the paranoia, the propaganda that biolabs equals biological weapons labs, which we've previously gone over in depth. If you missed that episode, those biolabs are biology labs, specifically screening labs, food safety labs, and veterinary labs. For those wishing to jump into conspiracy, Nuland erects a fucking diving board. But now we've gone so far off track we're missing the point entirely. At what point did Russia, its eye poked relentlessly by Western powers, decide to rise from its slumber and invade Ukraine? The answer is actually very simple. Nothing in the past 30 years of Ukraine's sovereignty incited the violation of Ukraine's borders, the bombing of its hospitals and infrastructure, the murder of its civilians. This war was an eventuality, one that Putin himself wrote about in a July 12, 2021 essay on the historical unity of Russians and Ukrainians. Whether it was written by Putin himself, we could guess. Most of the essay appears to be lifted from Wikipedia, but it acknowledges a complex history of the region over more than 1,000 years. But it is not the 1,000-year history Putin points to. Rather, he has a very specific date in mind. January 10th, 1918. That's the date the head of the Ukrainian delegation announced its intent to declare Ukraine a sovereign nation. Okay, well, what the fuck is the Ukrainian delegation? The February Revolution of 1917, which saw Russians revolt against the Russian monarchy, led to the demand of Russia's ethnic peoples, like Ukrainians, to seek autonomy and self-determination, which Ukrainians did in the creation of the Ukrainian People's Republic, UPR. In November of 1917, the UPR was a part of Russia, but 2 months later, January 10th, 1918, that's when the Ukrainian delegation announced they would be independent of Russia. And they did. January 22nd, 1918, is the date that the Central Rada, the All-Ukrainian Council, declared Ukrainian independence from Russia. Russia and Ukraine had been one nation officially for 2 months, over 100 years ago, and for the next 73 years, Ukraine would undergo, in Putin's words, quote, Ukrainization, a product of the Bolsheviks' localization policy, which again, Putin's words, quote, played a major role in the development and consolidation of the Ukrainian culture, language, and identity, end quote. Ukraine had the explicit right to secede from the USSR as outlined in the 1924 USSR Constitution. Ukraine the Republic, one of the many equal republics within the USSR, the equality there is important, became Ukraine the identity through Ukrainization, became Ukraine the sovereign nation with the dissolution of the USSR in 1991. Now, before we go into Putin's account of this story, I urge you to put this into context. Let's align our Western focus on another lazy analogy. Were Great Britain in 1876 to decide that 100 years before, a great injustice had been done to the British Empire by the United States declaring its independence, and if on that injustice Great Britain decided to reclaim its former colony, we would likely tell the King of England to go fuck himself. That's what we're dealing with here, but Putin can tell his own story. Quote, first of all, I would like to emphasize that the wall that has emerged in recent years between Russia and Ukraine, between the parts of what is essentially the same historical and spiritual space, to my mind, is our great common misfortune and tragedy. These are, first and foremost, the consequences of our own mistakes made at different periods of time. But these are also the result of deliberate efforts by those forces that have always sought to undermine our unity. The formula they apply has been known from time immemorial: divide and rule. There is nothing new here, hence the attempts to play on the national question and sow discord among people, the overarching goal being to divide and then to pit the parts of a single people against one another. End quote. Putin has declared in his essay's opener that Ukraine and Russia are in fact one territory, one nation, split from itself by Western powers, over a century ago. Quote, modern Ukraine is entirely the product of the Soviet era. We know and remember well that it was shaped for a significant part on the lands of historical Russia. The Bolsheviks treated the Russian people as inexhaustible material for their social experiments. They dreamt of a world revolution that would wipe out national states. That is why they were so generous in drawing borders and bestowing territorial gifts. One fact is crystal clear: Russia was robbed, indeed. End quote. So, to recap, 1918, Ukraine declared itself independent of Russia. 1924, Ukraine, Russia, and Belarus formed the USSR, a federation of republics with the right to secede. 1920s and 1930s, Ukraine undergoes Ukrainization. 1991, Ukraine, along with, like the rest of the USSR, secedes, and the USSR dissolves. Again, Putin. Quote, but the fact is that the situation in Ukraine today is completely different because it involves a forced change of identity. It would not be an exaggeration to say that the path of forced assimilation, the formation of an ethnically pure Ukrainian state aggressive towards Russia, is comparable in its consequences to the use of weapons of mass destruction against us. As a result of such a harsh and artificial division of Russians and Ukrainians, the Russian people in all may decrease by hundreds of thousands or even millions. I am confident that true sovereignty of Ukraine is possible only in partnership with Russia. Our spiritual, human, and civilizational ties, formed for centuries and have their origins in the same sources, they have been hardened by common trials, achievements, and victories. Together, we have always been and will be many times stronger and more successful, for we are one people." End quote. So, the tale of Ukraine's sovereignty, as told by Putin, is a fiction. It can only exist within Russia. It was birthed of revolt over a century ago, artificially curated by the Bolsheviks, and then, because the true aim of the USSR was to create a borderless, nationless union of all peoples, when it cleaved from Russia at the collapse of the Soviet Union, Russians within Ukraine, quote, "found themselves abroad overnight," end quote. Ukraine's existence was fact on paper alone. It had no historical or cultural basis. Russia may have tolerated that paper sovereignty, but Putin does not. What Putin sees within Ukraine, what he has seen in Ukraine since the Maidan Revolution, is not only a rejection of Russian influence, but an excision of Russian identity. Putin at least states as much in his 2021 essay. In the story of the West versus Russia, or in the very real sense, the US versus Russia, Ukraine becomes a mere object in a geopolitical tug-of-war. It does not exist as Ukraine proper, but Ukraine the thing to be exploited, to be grabbed, to be incorporated, to be eviscerated. Putin has stated that total destruction is his goal, at least in private. The US has stated its goal is Russia itself.
Ukraine will never be a victory for Russia, for free people refused to live in a world of hopelessness and darkness. We will have a different future, a brighter future, rooted in democracy and principles, hope and light, of decency and dignity, of freedom and possibilities. For God's sake, this man cannot remain in power.
We could, at the very least, acknowledge Ukrainian sovereignty as a real thing, one that is too easily overlooked by those in the West who see this as a proxy war. Ulterior motives most certainly exist for the US and Russia. We can figure those out in the aftermath. But a proxy war?
The tragedy is that it served to largely empower literal neo-Nazis. If there's one thing we can agree on, is there? That we don't want Nazis? Can we agree on that? No matter where you are on the political scale? While enacting only the goals of the Western powers that opportunistically lent their support, among which was the geopolitical equivalent of a predatory payday loan. So they offer them financial solutions based on compliance, and one could argue that the current war is in part a result of the conditions that were set out here.
That's Russell Brand reading and interpreting a Jacobin article by Branko Marcetic titled "A U.S.-backed far-right-led revolution in Ukraine helped bring us to the brink of war." A few things. One, we love Jacobin. In general, it's great. Go buy an issue. But as is the case with confirmation bias, Marcetic's article relies heavily on the far-right involvement in the Maidan as proof that the U.S. intentionally backed a far-right neo-Nazi overthrow of the Ukrainian government, though Marcetic concedes in the same article, quote, "Despite far-right parties ultimately losing seats in parliament, ultra-nationalist movements successfully shifted the country's politics to the extreme right, with Poroshenko and other centrists backing measures to marginalize the speaking of Russian and glorify Nazi collaborators," end quote. That's kind of like how Trump helped push the Republican Party into the deep red. Maidan had the undesirable effect of bringing a particularly dreadful component of society into the mainstream. But even this needs more context than Jacobin can provide. Published December 15th, 2019 in the Journal of Labor and Society, Ivan Kachanovsky's paper, "The Far Right, the Euromaidan, and the Maidan Massacre in Ukraine" concludes, quote, "The findings of this study reveal that the far-right organizations had significant but minority representation among the Maidan leadership and protesters. However, the analysis also shows that the far-right organizations and football ultras played a key role during violent attacks," end quote. Now that last part, the key role during violent attacks, that's not some protesters roughing up the Berkut. It's actually a lot worse. If you're listening closely, you'll notice I'm using the same background sounds I used in Poking the Bear Part 1, the part where I said that the Berkut openly slaughtered protesters. That's video taken of the Maidan protests in which snipers are targeting protesters. Except the sniper fire is coming from Maidan-controlled buildings, that is, buildings occupied by members of the far right. Kachanovsky, quote, "The far-right organizations and members were involved in the Maidan massacre of the protesters and the police and covering up of the Maidan snipers." End quote. See, I told you this was the story of two Maidans. Kachanovsky points out that Western and Russian coverage of the Maidan protests made key errors, omissions, or simply fabrications in their reporting of the Maidan massacre. In the West, reporting and even analysis by researchers far underplayed or even denied the far-right involvement, and it's a safe bet that you didn't know there had been a whole trial and investigation that found the Berkut wasn't responsible for the majority of deaths in the massacre. I sure didn't. But at the same time, the Russian narrative that this was a fascist coup and the new government was a fascist junta is simply wrong. Quote, "Neo-Nazi organizations did not have dominant roles among the Ukrainian far right." End quote. Dominant roles, no. Violent and bloody roles, yes. But back to the theory of the proxy war. To say that this is a proxy war implies that the US or the West in general intentionally caused the invasion of Ukraine, and through Ukraine is attacking Russia. We only have to look at the resulting Russophobia, outright hostility toward all things Russia, the unprecedented sanctions, the Biden administration's unprecedented release of strategic oil reserves, the unprecedented admission of Ukrainian refugees, to see that the U.S. is more than willing to show its hand as it simultaneously extends it to Ukraine. The hundreds of billions of dollars that will most likely be offered up in loans contingent upon economic restructuring by the International Monetary Fund to rebuild Ukraine is clearly visible on the horizon. We have written extensively on this subject in our book, Unfuck the Poor. We know this is what will happen. We can see the vultures circling. The problem with the proxy narrative isn't that these things won't happen. They very much will. The problem in this scenario is that Ukraine is a gamble. Perhaps the most sadistic and uncertain gamble the West could have put money on in the 21st century. Afghanistan was a brutality driven by oil. But Ukraine is no such thing. It's a totally new thing. It's a brutality solely for debt. The economy that emerges after Russian troops withdraw will be one manufactured for Ukraine by the West. Ukraine will indeed have been brought into the Western fold by means of debt restructuring, privatized national resources, and budget restrictions. All of that without the U.S. having to drop a single bomb on Ukraine, often a prerequisite for Western assistance. Break the vase, sell the glue. So, did the U.S. back the far-right Ukrainian nationalists who overthrew the government? The far-right lost parliamentary seats, mind you. Did the U.S. turn a blind eye to the violence of the far-right, underplay it, and ignore it? Absolutely. Is Putin correct in saying that the Ukrainian government is run by neo-Nazis? He is not, but neo-Nazis did indeed help overthrow Yanukovych. Did the U.S. meddle in the Ukrainian government? Indeed they did. Victoria Nuland explicitly recommended Arseniy Yatsenyuk for prime minister, which is exactly what happened. But she couldn't keep Klitschko out of the government, which was also her goal. This is the inevitably convoluted outcome, one in which the real truth really sucks. It would be awesome if neo-Nazis didn't exist, but they also didn't wind up ruling Ukraine. As much as its critics yield to it a near mythical power, the U.S. cannot at once orchestrate a civilian coup and force one country to invade another, especially not through paper threats like the 2021 joint statement on the U.S. and Ukraine, and not through investment in a military training base over 1,000 miles away from Russia's border. These moves, in spite of ulterior motives, were not engineered to provoke war. We should be able to say this with a straight face. It's like running with scissors. The danger of stabbing yourself through the eyeball is present, but not guaranteed. We could have at least had the common sense to listen when Putin said Russia took these moves as an existential threat. He obviously meant it. Still, this doesn't stain Zelensky's hands with blood. The end result is the destruction of Mariupol. At the time of this writing, the city of 400,000 has been nearly emptied. Some 150,000 remain, trapped, without food, water, and heat. They are not neo-Nazis. Remember far back when I explained the widespread general support the Maidan protests had throughout Ukraine? Students, activists, and politicians, pensioners, and the apolitical, all with different outrage against the government, all with different aspirations, those people who didn't care who spoke Russian, those are the people of Ukraine. And the end result is 10 million Ukrainians driven from their homes, 4 million refugees, 6 million internally displaced. The end result is the loss of homes, the loss of children, parents, grandparents. The end result is stalled peace talks, a Russian retreat that is not a retreat at all, but a regrouping. The end result is a humanitarian disaster. And this wasn't inevitable. We must now make a very real effort to see Ukraine not as an object, but as a sovereign nation, not unlike our own. Complex is its identity, but unified, and this is as important a distinction as the two Maidans, two completely different ideologies that composed the Ukrainian uprising that eventually became one. In much the same way, we now see a unified Ukraine in a fight against Russia itself, not against a puppet of Putin, not even with someone merely aligned with Putin, not Russia-backed, but Russia itself. Russia has spilled Ukrainian blood, and this is undeniable, and the complex identity and history of Ukraine now has definition. Ukraine is not Russia. It will not be Russia. Whatever horrors await Ukraine in the post-war economic future that it now finds itself heading towards, that is indeed the trajectory of Ukraine the sovereign. To be sure, we are guilty of being reckless and indeed poking the bear in the eye, repeatedly. Ukraine, however, is not guilty. It is perhaps the easiest stance to take and substantiate. Free of criticism? Controversy? Hardly. We have seen President Zelensky take extreme steps under martial law. Conscription, the consolidation of media to provide unified state messaging, the dissolution of all opposition political parties. We have seen in the West an equally disturbing willingness to deny access to Russian media. What harm does the presence of Russian media cause? Is it to minimize its impact in the West? It serves only to blind us. The deletion of Chris Hedges' RT series On Contact, an Emmy-nominated talk show hosted by Russian state television that ran for 6 seasons, has been deleted from YouTube. Hedges is a vocal opponent of imperialism. He is an opponent of this war. His series, if it spoke of politics, spoke negatively of Russia's involvement in global conflict as often as it spoke negatively of the United States' involvement in the same. What have we protected the West from in the erasure of Hedges' videos? Just one more voice. The West is as guilty of censorship and media consolidation as Russia and Ukraine. There is no high ground here. We are all being cut off from each other. Surely the U.S. has no leg to stand on in regards to the elimination of political parties. There are no political parties in the United States. There is the neoliberal order as represented by a donkey and an elephant. There is no political substance there. Same in Russia. How is this a valid critique of Ukraine? And conscription? What would we call the U.S. military's enticement of the state's poorest citizens for service? For many, it is the only way to afford higher education. For many, it is the only way to make a living. We have conscription in the U.S. We call it recruitment. We dangle a carrot and call the instinct to follow it patriotism. We could at least have the honesty to apply this criticism equitably. We could at least grant Ukraine the dignity of post hoc criticism. What has its people done that we should weigh our solidarity against the trespasses of their government? The innocence of state power is not under question. It is known not to exist. That the people of Ukraine want their state to have power, power against an invading force, that is sovereignty. Under attack, a national identity has solidified, an identity of resistance and resilience. That is a necessary power. We are seeing the evidence of civilian murders, not incidental shellings, but deliberate murder. We're getting reports of rape on women and children. We see the violation of humanity in real time, and as a result, the collective will of the people to resist. Critique the geopolitical powers and all their meddling, condemn the violence of the far right, but grant the people their sovereignty. grant them the dignity of embracing their human nature to collectively resist. This was Poking the Bear Part 2. As always, please check out helpingtoleave.org. It's an online volunteer network of Russian dissidents and expats helping to provide food, clothing, shelter, and evacuation routes out of Ukraine. helpingtoleave.org.